More than a dozen prisons were scattered in and around the capital city of Hanoi. American POWs gave them nicknames: Alcatraz, Briar Patch, Dirty Bird, the Hanoi Hilton, and the Zoo. "It's easy to die, but hard to live," a prison guard told one new arrival. "And we'll show you just how hard it is to live." American POWs in Vietnam struggled to survive horrid conditions, physical pain, and psychological deprivation, often for years on end. They exercised as best as they could. Some played mind games to keep themselves sane, making mental lists or building imaginary houses, one nail at a time. They drew strength from one another, secretly communicating via notes scratched with sooty machines on toilet paper, subtle hand gestures, or code tapped out on their cell walls. The code was based on two number combinations that represented each letter. It enabled prisoners to establish a command structure, keep a roster of captives, and pass information. "Our tapping ceased to be just an exchange of letters and words. It became conversation," recalled former prisoner of war James Stockton. Sadness, humor, sarcasm, excitement, depression, all came through. Although many prisoners would receive the worst kind of treatment, there was still room for nepotism. John McCain was just one of the nearly 800 American prisoners of war captured by the People's Army of Vietnam and the Viet Cong.
McCain is flying the Navy's A-4 Skyhawk, top speed 670 miles an hour.
McCain was on a bombing run over Hanoi. He had a target that he had been assigned. The anti-aircraft fire was very heavy that day.
Have targets too.
Surface-to-air missile hit my airplane and hit the right wing and took it off, and I went into a very violent spot.
He opened up the hatch and jumped out.
McCain ejects, breaking both arms and a knee in the process. He descends into the waiting arms of the enemy.
I came down in a lake near the center of the city of Hanoi. The Vietnamese, a group of them, came out and pulled me in.
He was met by an angry mob of civilian Vietnamese. Resented the fact that he was trying to drop bombs on their city. They kicked him, and they were treating him extremely badly.
And then they threw me in the back of a truck and took me to the prison that we know of as the Hanoi Hilton. I'll never forget the tapping to each other and the leadership.
Luckily, the Viet had found out by wire that McCain's father was a great, famous admiral.
They would hang him from his arms, yank his arms out of their sockets. They would beat him with sticks. They would engage in mental torture as well.
He doesn't wave like this. He waves like this. And that's because he can't lift his arms over his shoulders due to the torture that he suffered.
People that underwent far more severe brutality than I experienced, and they didn't crack, and they were my role models.
While young McCain was out in the forest being tortured and watching his friends get maimed, his father peered into the deep Viet forest, imagining, ruminating, contemplating. He would continue this routine even after McCain was freed from his suffering. He would never ask anything from his son ever again. In silence, he would go to the demilitarized zone between South and North Vietnam and inspect the country from a distance for years. Major Harold Johnson knew going into being a fighter pilot that the survival rate was 50%, but what he may not have known, after over 90 secret missions as a wild weasel, was that although he would survive, his luck would eventually run out.
Every day you were shot at very severely, and went right up the tailpipe and exploded, and we had the smoke and fire and whatever. And said, "Get out there." So I did.
Both men ejected safely, but were later captured. Before being taken to a prisoner of war camp, Johnson was paraded through a nearby village.
And They were screaming and hollering, throwing rocks, and some used sharp bamboos, and they were stabbing, and I still got scars on my leg. Kids were the worst. They could slip through the guards, and I had a lot of holes in me when I got to the camp.
His captors tortured him virtually every day.
At the end of about 8 days, when I started having so many hallucinations and pointing out targets here and a target there and whatever, I had no idea.
A year into his captivity, Johnson's value as an intelligence source was exhausted, but the torture continued.
They asked these questions and expected you to answer.
Americans held prisoner in North Vietnam experienced boredom, discomfort, hunger, and torture over the period of their captivity. Each of these conditions was deliberately imposed on the POWs by their Vietnamese captors. They accomplished this isolation by maintaining a number of camps scattered throughout northern Vietnam. Ensuring the cell was dark also meant there was no air circulation. Rats, bugs, and spiders abounded in these cells. Food and water were limited. There would be nothing in the room except for a waste bucket. At times even this was removed. If there was a waste bucket, the prisoner might be allowed to empty it once a day, or not. In some cases, the prisoner's hands would be tied behind his back and his ankles tied or put in cuffs. This could and would go on for weeks. Communication of any kind was generally forbidden, and severe punishment administered to those who ignored that rule. The Vietnamese wanted every individual prisoner to feel abandoned and alone. Constant pressure was applied on the individual to write or record statements against the war which could be shown to other POWs or printed in communist or Western publications. If a POW felt alone, it was easier for his interrogators to convince the prisoner to give in to their demands for propaganda material. Many prisoners went months, even years, without face-to-face communication with another American. They were tortured for communicating with their fellow POWs. They were tortured to force them to meet with peace delegates, to obtain statements against the war. They were tortured for refusing to display the correct attitude toward their captors. They were tortured to obtain information on their units, their fellow pilots, unit tactics, and aircraft capabilities. Camps holding American prisoners in the South did not have housing. They had shelter. This shelter was commonly a few simple thatch huts for the guards and bamboo cages for Americans. The cages were frequently not large enough to allow the prisoner to stand up in, and the bed consisted of the bamboo or dirt floor of the cage. At one time or another in their captivity, many prisoners in the South were kept isolated in a single bamboo cage. If not alone, they were typically kept out of sight and sound of other Americans also held in that camp. Some prisoners were held in groups of 12 to 15. One this size consisted of bamboo huts surrounded by a bamboo fence. Inside the enclosure were guard huts, a prisoner hut, and a latrine pit. The prisoners slept on a bamboo platform about 3 feet off the ground. Designed for 5 or 6, the platform had to accommodate whatever number of POWs was held there at different times. In another camp, the prisoners slept in hammocks in cages set below ground level. Southern camps were typically located in dismal swamps or triple canopy forest. Actual sunlight was so rare, prisoners would sit in whatever rays managed to penetrate the forest floor. The location of the camp itself could be detrimental to the health of the POWs. These camps were open to the elements. Malaria was common in southern POW camps, as were fungal infections, leeches, snakes, scorpions, centipedes, and ants. One POW described a particular camp in the south as hideous, leech, and insect-filled. In the monsoon season, the camps would be a sea of mud, with the common problem of dysentery and people frequently not making it to the latrine pit before a bowel movement. This mud became a sea of filth. 8 American POWs were held in what they called Camp Delta, across the border in Cambodia. They had no shelters and slept chained in hammocks. They were kept 30 feet apart, with the jungle foliage so thick they often could not see another. After this camp, they were moved into camp monkey cages. They spent a year in cages set below ground. 2 of them spent a month of that year locked in those cages for punishment. Many of the pilots had been trained in a code system, a series of knocks or taps that could line up right and down with a 5-column grid of letters to spell out words. One knock followed by a pause and one other knock made an A. One knock followed by 2 knocks was a B. Men faced with the hopelessness of a military prison and the uncertainty of what a day might bring from the enemy soon become desperate to communicate with others. Morale was essential, and one of the keys to morale was to beat the enemy as often as possible in their attempts to isolate. They wrote notes using cigarette papers and toilet paper, their ink made from ashes and water. They crawled through ceiling vents for short visits to other rooms. The communication was important because it meant they weren't alone. It symbolized camaraderie in the worst of environments. The goal of the North Vietnamese was to get written or recorded statements from the prisoners that criticized U.S. conduct of the war and praised how the North Vietnamese treated them. Such POW statements would be viewed as a propaganda victory in the battle to sway world and U.S. domestic opinion against the U.S. war effort. Some POWs have written books, including a former jet pilot, Weidman. In his memoir, Unexpected Prisoner, he found himself tumbling through the clear skies over North Vietnam. I looked out at the coast about 2 miles away and I thought about my wife and my family, he said. He wondered if he'd ever see home again as he sent distress signals and called for help on the radio. I made a couple of transmissions, Weidman said. I got no response. Then about that time I heard the whistling sound of a bullet. When he hit the earth, he had 2 broken fingers and a dinged up shoulder. He saw a North Vietnamese soldier standing about 25 yards away with him with a group of villagers behind him. They all had knives, Weidman said. They had me down to my underwear in about 30 seconds. Weidman was whisked to a nearby hut and blindfolded. His hands were tied behind his back. He could hear a small battle transpiring outside, the sound of U.S. aircraft attempting to rescue him. Weidman thought that there was no chance they'd find him. He wanted his rescuers to go away, to be safe. Soon they did. Then Weidman's captors rushed him from the hut and marched him for what seemed to be several miles through rice paddies and hostile villages. He was put in a truck and finally taken to a dark room where an interrogator was waiting. Weidman recalls the interrogation. The interrogator says, "What's your name?" I said, "Robert Weidman." He says, "How old are you?" I say, 23. And he says, "What city are you from?" I say, "I can't answer that question." He says, "Well, if you don't answer, I'm gonna have my guards take you out and shoot you." Then he asks me again. I say, "I'd really like to answer that question, but my government won't allow me to answer that question." His captors cinched ropes so tightly around his arms that they felt like barbed wire cutting to the bone. His arms turned purple, and he was told that if he didn't talk soon, he was going to lose them. He started to convulse. He shouted that he never talk. Then he gave in. So they untied the rope. He says, "What city are you from?" I says, "Cleveland, Ohio." He says, "Okay, Ralbert." They like to call me Ralbert. He says, "Now you can go to sleep." So they hog-tied me to a 2x4, and I went to sleep. There were more interrogations in the days and weeks to come. Sometimes the questions seemed friendly, other times important, like what radio frequency Weidman used with his unit. Yet when he tried to lie, his captors already knew the answers, and he was punished. I got a sick feeling in my stomach, and he had the guards this time put me in manacles behind my back and tied my elbows until they touched. Basically, your shoulders feel like they're going to pop out of joint, Weidman said. For some people they did. You can't breathe, you get claustrophobia, and on the way out he takes a little broom and he sticks it in my mouth and says, "Don't cry," and they walk out the door. And I'm thinking I'm gonna lose it, and then they had me figured out. They came back about 20 minutes later, untied me, put me on a stool, looks at me and says, "Why did you lie?" I say, "Because I'm stupid." Weidman talked. He feels terrible. There's pretty much no way you can resist that stuff. Eventually he was taken to a little windowless room in Hanoi and placed with a few other POWs. No books, Weidman said, no games, no nothing. It was boring. I was counting squares on the ceiling. He received 2 meals a day, rice or a third of a loaf of French bread, bland bamboo or cabbage soup, maybe squash on the side. His fellow prisoners kept him company, but the conversations became circular. Writing for Politico, Congressman Sam Johnson describes his brutal tenure at the Hanoi Hilton in great detail, including the tortures visited upon him and his fellow POWs. At Johnson's words, "As a POW in the Hanoi Hilton, I could recall nothing from military survival training that explained the use of a meat hook, suspended from the ceiling. It would hang above you in the torture room like a sadistic tease. You couldn't drag your gaze from it. During a routine torture session with the hook, the Vietnamese tied a prisoner's hands and feet, then bound his hands to his ankles, sometimes behind the back, sometimes in front. The ropes were tightened to the point where you couldn't breathe, then bowed or bent in half. The prisoner was hoisted up onto the hook to hang by ropes. Guards would return at intervals to tighten them until all feeling was gone, and the prisoner's limbs turned purple, and swelled to twice their normal size. This would go on for hours, sometimes even days. Aside from leg irons and leg stocks, both of which were used on me for months and years on end, the meat hook was a favorite instrument of torture at the Hanoi Hilton. Harry Jenkins, another Hanoi Hilton resident, was hung by the meat hook solely from his wrists, which were tied behind his back. He was in so much pain that he begged to die. Thereafter, he was forced to kneel in gravel so long the skin ripped from his knees. Beatings were common at the prison, and those who carried them out had a number of tools at their disposal, including fan belts and whips. POWs were lashed across the back and buttocks. Beatings were often severe, and frequently accompanied by other methods of torture. As Jeremiah Denton told the Los Angeles Times, they beat you with fists and fan belts. They warmed you up and threatened you with death. Then they really got serious and gave you something called the rope trick. Around midnight on that first day in captivity, McNish arrived at the Hanoi Hilton. For the next couple of days, McNish was housed in the Nobby torture room. The NVA asked McNish for all of his military information, who he was, rank, serial number, purpose of mission, and so forth. While sitting on a stool, every time McNish refused to answer the question, he would get beaten and slapped around. When they figured out I wasn't going to talk very much, they started getting serious with what we called Vietnamese rope trick. It's where they would tie your elbows together behind your back with the rope, McNish said. Believe it or not, your elbows can touch behind your back. Then they put leg irons on your legs and leave you. That becomes a very painful situation because you lose all the circulation to your lower arms and you start losing feeling in your hands, and that turns into pain, and then it gets worse. It'd be another 3 months until McNish saw another American POW. Housed in a complex known as Heartbreak in the Hanoi Hilton, McNish and others were placed in cells, 2 meters square concrete bunks with stocks at the end of the bed where the POW's feet could be locked into place. It turns out the way to make sure that there's somebody there and that they're an American was just the old standard shaven haircut knocking bit. If it's an American, they're gonna come back with the 2 taps. The Vietnamese learned that it was our signal for initiating communication, and they would try to trick us by doing that, but they could never get the rhythm right, McNish said. To keep track of the time passing, the POWs knew the Vietnamese took Sundays off, so the Americans could figure out exactly what day it was, and were also able to recalibrate into the next week. The Vietnamese rope trick was one of the most brutal methods of torture endured by the American POWs at the Hanoi Hilton. The method involved binding the arms behind the back with the rope, then rotating them upward until the shoulders popped out of their sockets. Victims were sometimes strung from the ceilings and beaten as they hung. The ropes were bound so tightly that they cut off the circulation, causing numbness and muscle spasms in the extremities that endured long after the POWs were repatriated. Many American POWs had to endure handcuffing, not only as a restraint, but also as a form of torture. Ratchet-based police handcuffs, dubbed the hell cuffs, were tightened to the point where they dug into the skin. Circulation was cut off such that the victim's hands would turn black, and the nerves were compressed, causing damage. Non-adjustable metal manacles left over from the French colonials were used in this manner. They were designed for Vietnamese wrists, and could only be closed on typically thicker American wrists with force. Inmates were put into hand and leg irons and left throughout the night in contorted positions, helpless against tiny little North Vietnamese aircraft, the Mosquitoes. All the inmates could do was to puff bursts of air, rather futilely, at the miniature blood-sucking assailants. During holidays, the camp authority would improve their treatment a bit. On Christmas, they offered sweets and bananas in front of a camera. Many devoured the much-needed food. However, when offered a cigarette, Commander Jim Mulligan, who had smoked over 2 packs a day before his capture, in an attempt not to do anything his enemies suggested, shook his head and said rather scornfully, "Your country is too poor. Give it to your army and your people." Vietnamese used starvation as a form of torture. When they were fed, prisoners were given watery soup with human feces or rocks. George McKnight, who was eventually transferred out of the Hanoi Hilton for his resistance to torture and a daring escape attempt, once spent 34 days in an air raid trench as a form of torture, his hands tied behind his back. McKnight was 6 feet and 2 inches tall. The trench was 4 feet long. POWs were forced to kneel or stand in uncomfortable positions for hours, or even days on end, on concrete floors, then bound in place with ropes or handcuffs and left for long periods. This could go on for days, during which prisoners had to wallow in their own urine and feces. They could not sleep or rest. If they fell over, guards put them upright again. A guard nicknamed Mouse liked to throw buckets of ice water on prisoners during winter nights when they were bound to the stool in irons or forced to kneel. One soldier held out under stool torture for 33 days. When no longer under direct supervision, prisoners would shift to a more comfortable position, only to be beaten when guards discovered they moved. Sometimes they had to hold their arms aloft for long periods. Other times they had pencils placed behind the knees, as they were kneeling to make it more painful. U.S. prisoner of war Ron Stores faced a twist on the usual stool torture when he was forced to stand on his stool for a week straight, during which time he was nearly beaten to death with a bamboo stick. Locking prisoners in ankle stocks or leg irons was very common. This might be continued for 4 or 5 days, during which time the POW would never be released from the stocks. That meant urinating and defecating on their sleeping platforms and themselves. It was common during this 4 or 5 day period not to be given any food or water, which helped keep down the mess, although weakness from starvation was the intended effect. If further punishment was to be given, the POW would be fed bread and water once a day after the initial period of starvation. Release from the stocks might come periodically to use the waste bucket or to be interrogated. There were POWs who endured weeks and even months of this treatment. When kept in ankle stocks for longer periods of time, they might be allowed out of the stocks for 10 minutes out of each 24-hour day to clean their waste bucket. One POW was given 85 days in leg irons as punishment. I was blindfolded and they marched me through sort of a line of people who were beating on me, former Air Force Captain Gary Sigler said. And when they took the blindfold off, there was a bayonet about 3 inches from my nose. He feared he would die before he would come home to his family. We had sort of a joke in POW humor that said the pessimist was the guy that said, "We're never gonna get out of here," and the optimist was the guy that said, "Oh, they'll send our bodies back," and I was sort of the optimist type, he said. The captors would enter the cell individually or in groups and punch and kick the prisoner. Ribs, teeth, and noses were often broken in these beatings. Flogging was practiced by some guards. They used light bamboo rods or rubber whips cut from old tires. There are accounts of POWs receiving 300 blows from such a rubber whip in one session. Beatings were part of the common practice of sleep deprivation. If this took place in a torture room, the prisoner would be forced to sit on a stool or cement block about 8 inches high. This position was designed to be physically uncomfortable. They would be punched and screamed at every half hour or so to keep them awake, or if they fell off the stool, they would not even be allowed to leave the stool for bowel movements. This would continue for 4 or 5 days until the prisoner agreed to the guard's demands. If the sleep deprivation took place while the prisoner was in his cell, he would be forced to stand and bow every time a guard entered the cell. Guards would come into the cell several times an hour. If the POW did not rise and bow, he was punched and kicked. Sleep deprivation was used as a punishment or an attempt to get the prisoner to write propaganda statements. As a 22-year-old, Parker was among the older men in his unit. His commanding officer, Captain Roland Belcher, told the company while they were enjoying in-country R&R at brigade headquarters in Chu Lai that he was proud of the work they were doing. Captain Belcher had been in a province southwest of Saigon where we were providing security for elections, Parker said. He said it meant a lot to him that we were able to do that, to make sure those people could go to the polls and not get hurt. I remember that because he died in the rice paddies when we were ambushed. Parker's first sergeant, nicknamed Top, was a 41-year-old veteran of World War II and Korea who had earned a Silver Star before joining the company. After the ambush, he was the ranking person and he held us together. Parker and his company were on patrol when they broke contact with the enemy in a creek bed. The North Vietnamese unloaded on the unit and killed 2 men. As the most forward man, Parker was pinned down. I'm thinking, I'm gonna die. Top is behind me telling me to switch to auto and fire. They tried to get behind us and I hear a Vietnamese voice and do a 90 degree. Within arm's reach at the top of this creek bank is an NVA soldier with a pit helmet and Top is there with no helmet. There's a guy with a rifle telling me to get up. The NVA are stripping everything off us, anything they can use. I tried to bury my M16 in the creek bed, but they got it. After being taken, Parker was left with the soldier with a sidearm who walked in front of him, leading him away from the creek. I thought it was odd he was in front of me and I had been taught that you always try to escape. Next thing I know, my hand is over his mouth and I have his arm at his side. I know I have to kill him and do it silently, but his bayonet won't come out of his scabbard. and by that time my hand has come off his mouth and he's yelling bloody murder. Before I could get his .45, he stabs me in the side with his bayonet. By that time, there are a bunch of rifles pointing at me. I'm surprised they didn't just shoot me. They took some commo wire and duck-winged me that night. Of the 15 men who entered the rice paddy that evening, only 4 made it out. More men would join Harker in the Trung Son mountain range where he would spend the first 3 years of captivity. By Harker's estimation, only about 150 U.S. soldiers were captured in South Vietnam, most of whom were taken to the Tet Offensive. Harker's prison was in Quang Nam province, a difficult mountainous country that made food scarce and meant deplorable living conditions for the POWs. We buried 9 Americans there, Harker said. That's how horrific our living conditions were. We had very little to eat, so people died of starvation, including the youngest person we had there, a 19-year-old Marine. In the mountains, the men had to forage for food, mostly the manioc root, also known as cassava root. There wasn't a place to grow food, so most of our calories came from manioc, Harker said. We were under a 1-to-1 prisoner-to-guard ratio, and the guards would trade manioc. We would put baskets on our backs and go back and forth over miles of mountain trails carrying 70 to 80 pounds of root. It's amazing to think that we could even do it, but we did what we had to do. The little bit of rice they gave us as a ration wasn't enough to keep a bird flying, so the roots kept us going. The guards of Trung Son didn't physically abuse the prisoners. They didn't need to. We were separated from civilization in the middle of nowhere, and we couldn't communicate, had no food, and no medical attention. That's torture enough for an individual. We were interrogated when we were captured, Harker said, but we knew the code of conduct. We'd give that information. But they have a guy with a lantern, and they're asking information about your unit, its size, and I just kept repeating. They put a blindfold on you, and all you can hear is a round being chambered. In the north, they beat pilots and used a lot of torture techniques. There were a dozen men still alive in the mountains, and they were taken in groups of 6 to begin their march north up the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Harker watched battalions of Vietnamese troops head south during the 60-day march as they ground out 10 to 15 miles a day. Eventually we were put on a train in a boxcar and taken to Hanoi to Plantation Garden, an old French plantation with bars in the walls. We were kept in a 15 by 17 warehouse, 6 of us on a wooden pallet. Unlike the mountain camp, we couldn't roam around, and the boredom would overtake you and the heat was oppressive, but we had plenty to eat compared to the South. In December 1972, the Air Force conducted an operation called Linebacker 2, a maximum effort campaign to destroy targets using B-52 heavy bombers that dropped more than 15,000 tons of ordnance on more than 30 targets. We were ecstatic, Harker said. We'd hear doors open and activity. They came and said, "You're going, and you're going," dividing us up into groups that would be repatriated. They gave us Western clothing and a travel bag, and when they pulled us out of a holding cell wearing our red striped pajamas, we were given the clothes. They gave us food and told us peace agreement was broken, and we were right back down to the depths of despair. But a few days later we got out. I remember saluting an Air Force general who was sitting with a North Vietnamese officer, and when he saluted, we had been officially repatriated. On the plane home, the pilot told us when we had entered international airspace, and there was a great cheer. The cheers continued when they landed in the Philippines, Hawaii, and Andrews Air Force Base, Maryland. It was exciting coming home. A private airline flew me and my father, and the local TV station had sent a reporter who had interviewed me all the way back. There must have been 10,000 people at the Lynchburg airport when we arrived. I had no idea that would be this welcoming response. My big extended family, the high school band was there. It was a long journey, and I was glad to be home, and for them to be there for me meant so much. I was led to a blue 1973 Corvette and handed the keys. A group of schoolmates had gotten together and sold bumper stickers for $1 each to buy me a car, and they handed me the keys and a check for $1,100. He still drives it today. I think of all the love behind it every time I drive it. Some POWs never made it out of Hanoi Hilton. During the Vietnam War, 766 Americans were taken confirmed prisoners of war. Of them, 114 were confirmed to die in captivity. The actual number is most likely higher because most of the denizens of the Hanoi Hilton and other North Vietnamese prisons died while considered missing in action. Edwin Atterbury, U.S. Air Force captain, was beaten to death May 18, 1969 at the zoo, 8 days after escaping. He was recaptured the same day. While on a mission supporting South Vietnamese irregulars against the Viet Cong, Rowe and his fellow Green Berets walked into an ambush. The men fought valiantly, but after exchanging fire they were overpowered and taken as prisoners. When they reached the POW camp, they were separated and locked in cages, entering a living hell that they would endure for the next 5 years. It only got worse for Rowe. The Viet Cong knew he was the leader of his unit and suspected he had information. They were right. Rowe served as the captured unit's intelligence officer and possessed exactly the kind of information the Viet Cong desperately needed. As a result, Rowe had to endure near constant torture on top of the already deplorable conditions of the prison. At one point, Rowe confessed his position, claiming he was just an engineer, but the VC weren't going to let him off easy. They cut the torture to give Rowe engineering problems to solve. Amazingly, despite the fact that he was starving, living in a cage, and actually was not an engineer, he completed it correctly. His torturers were satisfied, and Rowe thought he could rest easy thanks to West Point's mandatory engineering courses. He was wrong. Around the same time, a group of American peace activists were on a mission to visit American officers in Vietnamese prisoner of war camps. Rowe's name was on their list of officers to visit, along with the fact that he was a Special Forces intelligence officer. When the Viet Cong discovered the lie, they forced Rowe to stand naked in a swamp for days on end, leaving him ravaged by mosquitoes and dizzy with lack of food or water. They were fed up with this phony engineer and his multiple escape attempts, and decided enough was enough. They gave Rowe an execution date, eager to rid themselves of his antics. When the day finally came, Rowe was led far away from the camp, when suddenly a group of American helicopters thundered overhead, rustling the jungle trees and giving Rowe the split second of time he needed to break free, fend off his captors, and sprint after the helicopters. Amazingly, one of the choppers noticed Rowe waving like a maniac in a clearing and was able to rescue him from a scheduled death. 6 young servicemen, fresh from the prison camps of North Vietnam, stood at attention, saluted, and wept as their comrade was lowered into his grave in a Denver cemetery. Marine Corps Sergeant Able Larry Cavanaugh, 24, had been like a brother to them, and before he had fired a bullet into his brain a few days earlier, they had shared many grim years together as POWs. But they had another bond. Cavanaugh and his buddies had all been accused of collaborating with the enemy while imprisoned. They had made anti-war broadcasts, cooperated with their captors, and had written letters condemning the conflict, a senior officer charged. 2 were accused of making wooden models of American aircraft so the North Vietnamese could hone their marksmanship. Fellow prisoners called them traitors and communists. Formal military charges had been filed after their release, but the prospect of more incarceration was too much for Cavanaugh. After his suicide on June 27, 1973, his wife said the Pentagon had murdered her husband. The North Vietnamese kept him alive for years, she said. Then he came back to America and his own people killed him. All 8 had been accused by U.S. Air Force Colonel Theodore W. Guy, who was the senior officer in their POW camp, Plantation Gardens. Guy filed the charges May 29, 1973, claiming the men had aided the enemy, conspired to undermine discipline, accepted preferential treatment, and disobeyed orders. The 8 denied the charges, noting that other POWs had cooperated with the enemies in various ways. One called the accusations ridiculous. Who had been captured April 24, 1968, became depressed and paranoid. He thought his phone was being tapped, that he was being followed, and would speak only in whispers to his wife. A psychologist testified at a coroner's inquest into his death. On his first night home with his wife and his 5-year-old daughter, he had packed his bags and said he was leaving the country. His wife dissuaded him. On June 27, 1973, in a bedroom of his father-in-law's house in Colorado, Cavanaugh shot himself with a .25 caliber pistol. The psychologist said later that he had become borderline psychotic and had been unable to tell the difference between reality and fantasy. The day after the funeral, the Pentagon dismissed all the charges. Van Loan, now 83 and retired, describes his initial treatment from a Hanoi prison. Somebody grabbed me and hauled me into what we came to know as the Nobby room. There was just a table and a couple of chairs behind it, and a stool in front, and they told me to sit in the stool. So I sat down and waited. After some considerable period of time, maybe 45 minutes, in came what I took to be a couple of officers. I didn't know for sure if they were officers. They were wearing brown tunics with some kind of little epaulets on them. One of them spoke English, and he said, "What is your name?" I told them my name, my rank, my major service number, and my date of birth. Then he said, "What was your aircraft?" And he started into these more specific questions. I kept repeating name, rank, service number, and date of birth. Finally, he said, "That is not going to suffice." You're going to have to talk to us." I told him I was required by the Geneva Conventions, only to give him name, rank, service number, and date of birth. Then the guy literally exploded. He screamed, "The Geneva Convention does not apply." I asked why not, and he said, "You are criminals. This is an undeclared war, and you have attacked our country, and you are not going to be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You are going to talk to us, or we're going to punish you, because you are violating the camp regulations." I didn't know what the hell to say. My knee was hurting pretty badly, and I was thinking to myself, geez, I really took a wrong turn here, but there was not a hell of a lot I could do. He kept asking me questions, zeroing in on targeting. A very muscular guy came in. He was sort of small, but I'll tell you, he was as strong as a sadistic ox. He knocked me off the stool, grabbed the ropes, and proceeded to tie me up. He put manacles on me, with my hands behind my back. He put my feet in irons, with the metal bar running behind my ankles, perpendicular to my body. Boy, he cinched up those ropes really tight. When they put a rope around my neck, and I thought, you know, I'm in real trouble here. I'm in more trouble than I've ever been in my life. I just thought, I can't talk and I can barely breathe. One false move and I'm dead. I tried to knock myself out by beating my head on the floor. A substantial number of POWs were killed in interrogation, and now they had me in ropes. A lot of people had been seen on the ground after bailing out who just disappeared. I know now what happened to them. They went into the Nobby room and they died there. That was almost my fate too. They were all business, and they were dead damn serious. I was sort of detached. I heard all this screaming and I thought, my God, somebody's really getting hurt. It was scary as hell. I had never had anything like that happen to me, and it went on for what seemed like hours. They had attached a rope around my arms, which were tied together behind my back, elbows touching, and threw it over a hook in the ceiling. They hauled me up off the ground and began bouncing me up and down. This dislocated my right shoulder. I finally screamed that I would talk, and the officers came back in. I was in and out. I have no idea how long that went on. Finally, the little guy who had tied me up loosened the bindings a little bit. Releasing the ropes caused the pain to be excruciating as the blood rushed back into my arms. The ropes had cut into my left arm. My right shoulder was dislocated and I was a disaster. I was on my hands and knees. That was all I could do. I couldn't stand. I couldn't do anything. I lost all circulation in my hands, my arms, and my feet. To this day, if it gets below 55 degrees, both of my hands just turn white. I don't have circulation in my hands at all. There are a whole bunch of us who don't. My arms go to sleep, my hands go to sleep if I lie in bed. It's still scary now when that happens, and it was terrifying as hell at the time. Then they pulled the rag out of my mouth. I had damn near strangled on it, and I threw up at that point. I was a basket case, crawling around on my hands and knees with blood everywhere. They told me to get back on the stool. I thought, you gotta be shitting me. I can't get off the ground. Then the guy kicked me a couple of times in the groin just for emphasis, and that spurred me. I finally managed to crawl up on the stool. I was sitting there just crying my eyes out. I had never been hurt like that before in my life. One other POW put his own breaking point horrifically. One guy made a rope tourniquet around my upper arm. He inserted a piece of wood and twisted until my nerves cut against the bone. The hand was completely unusable for 6 months. Finally, Dengler arrived at his destination, a prisoner of war camp. I had been looking forward to it, he said. I hoped to see other pilots. What I saw horrified me. The first one who came out was carrying his intestines around in his hands. There were 6 other captives. 4 Thais and 2 fellow Americans, Dwayne Martin and Eugene De Bruin, plagued by awful infections. He had begged the others to knock them out with a rock and a rusty nail in order to release pus from his gums. They had been there for 2.5 years, said Dengler. I looked at them and it was just awful. I realized that was how I would look in 6 months. The guards would stalk deer, pulling the grass out of the animal's stomach for the prisoners to eat while they shared the meat. The prisoners' only treats were snakes they occasionally caught from the communal latrine, or the rats that lived under their hut which they could spear with sharpened bamboo. The POW camps were in remote swamps or jungle forests, and since camps had to be moved frequently, rice could not be grown locally. The rice fed to the POWs had been transported long distances and stored for long periods of time. This meant the rice received by the POWs in the south was rotten and full of bugs and rat feces. When supply lines were disrupted, the rice ration had to be supplemented with whatever was available. At various times, POWs ate elephant, ape, snake, dog, and rat. The guards would add protein to their own meals with chickens, eggs, and pork when available. With no shoes, their feet were easily injured, and infections often followed. Dengler and his fellow prisoners were handcuffed together and shackled to medieval-style footblocks. They suffered chronic dysentery and were made to lie in their excrement. Dengler fired, zigzagging into the jungle. They found the sole of an old tennis shoe, which they alternated wearing, strapping it onto a foot with rat. In the morning, they would be covered in mud and hundreds of leeches. So weak that they could barely crawl up the riverbank. The men eventually reached a settlement, but the villagers who greeted them were far from welcoming. Death didn't want me. It was 5 days later, on July 20th, 1966, that Dengler heard an American airplane overhead and summoning up his last reserves of strength. Flying low over the dangerous, impenetrable Laotian jungle on a bombing mission against the Viet Cong, U.S. Air Force Colonel Eugene Dietrich saw a figure waving to him from a clearing below. He continued on his flight path, but 10 minutes later, puzzled that a native in this hostile terrain would try to attract his attention, he decided to turn back for another recce. This time, he saw the letters SOS spelt out on a rock. Beside them stood an emaciated man dressed in rags, waving the remains of a parachute over his head and signaling desperately. The only American ever to break out of a prisoner of war camp in the Laotian jungle. Inside Hanoi's secret archives, solving the MIA mystery, quotes a Vietnamese intelligence officer as telling Theodore Schweitzer, a Pentagon contract agent, "Our government does not want America to know that our darkest secret is that we killed many American prisoners in cold blood." Lieutenant Colonel Van Thai, a general political directorate officer in the People's Army of Vietnam, is quoted as saying, "They were tortured to death in our prison, or simply killed outright from fear that they would try to escape. Our leaders are afraid to admit this." Thai's quoted, "They were tortured to death here in Hanoi, and they were killed in other parts of the country." Asked how many had died, Thai replied, "Perhaps hundreds." Schweitzer, who spent 7 months on a covert U.S. government mission to gather POW and MIA information in Hanoi in 1992, is credited on the book's cover as its researcher. The harsh treatment of U.S. prisoners in Vietnam is well documented, notably by 591 Americans repatriated shortly after the Paris Peace Accords were signed in January 1973. Colonel Joseph Schlatter, acting deputy director of the Defense Department's POW-MIA office, confirmed that Schweitzer had successfully penetrated the previously secret Vietnamese military archives. He didn't discount the book's claim that the Vietnam is withholding detailed written records that would help account for missing Americans, including those allegedly tortured. Garnett Bell, chief of Hanoi-based U.S. POW-MIA office in 1991 and 1992, said in a phone interview, "Many of the missing POWs, known to have been captured alive but still not accounted for, were executed on orders of the party."